Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nuggets to help you on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to a new season of I Am Dad Podcast. This is our fourth season, and we have another enlightening episode of I Am Dad Podcast today. We are honored to have with us Dr. David Pate. He's a distinguished Associate Professor of Consumer Science and Human Development and Family Studies and the Dean's Fathers and Fathering Facility Fellow. With over 16 years of practicing social work and a rich academic career, David has dedicated his life to uplifting Black men and families, challenging stereotypes, and advocating for systemic change. David's groundbreaking research examines the intersection of race, class, and gender, focusing on how social welfare policies impact African American men and their families. Through quantitative methods, he amplifies the voices of marginalized fathers, exploring their relationships with their children, the child support system, and the challenges of reentry after incarceration. Today, we delve into David's inspiring journey, his impactful work, and his vision for a more equitable future for families and communities. Please join me today as we welcome Dr. David Pate to the stage. Good morning, and how you doing, sir?
Good morning, Ken. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Hey, long time coming. I have not, over the course of now, this starting our fourth season, realized how many people I know and how many people are out there and how many people are in this work, and sifting through the long list of voices that I want people to hear and people to know. You know, oftentimes with me, what reminds me of the criticalness of people's voices is when I'm out there and I happen, like I did with you, run into you. And like, oh my goodness, I got to get this man on the podcast to talk about his work, so people really have a sense of the depth of the work that we do and the perspectives of us that are doing this work. We start our show off very interestingly because it sets the stage for the content of the conversation, and it gets people to know a little more about you in the sense of telling us your daddy story. What's your daddy story?
Well, that's interesting. I love how this starts, and thank you again for the invitation. So I don't know where you want me to start, but
Wherever you want, it's your story.
um, I could always start with why I decided to do Black men as my focus of work as a social worker, but also as an academic. When I was a student, as an undergrad student, I had decided that academia was really stereotyping and demonizing Black men. And I decided that as a social worker, I did not want to maintain that story. But also, as someone who was raised on food stamps and AFDC, and at some point in my life, our family was homeless for 5 years. I got to have a feel of what it meant to be poor and to not have access to services, but also to be labeled as someone who was less than. Even though I have to give my mother and stepfather credit, I never thought of myself as poor, even when we were homeless and slept in the park. I really felt that we were just having daily life, and we got evicted from our home. And I remember very clearly being evicted from home at 10 years old, and the sheriff coming and throwing all our toys and everything on the street. And I can see it so clearly today, but I still never felt like I was someone who was less than. Thanks to my mother at that time, who we just started walking and ended up at a McDonald's, and then we ended up at the street. And then we eventually ended up in my aunt's, who we lived with for a number of years. And I decided from there, based on how white social workers treated us, that I didn't like that. Because at that time there was the man in the house rule, where they would show up at any time, just go through your closet and go and look underneath the bed. And people don't realize that type of trauma or that type of experience as a kid, it really does stay with you, and it has an impact on how you are able to either go left or go right. And thanks to my own experience as a young adult, in high school and in college, and the people I met along the way, I was able to make a turn where things always worked out to the betterment. where it didn't always do that well for everybody in my family. But for me, it did work out well. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I went through college, I decided to be a social worker because I really felt it was important to have Black representation of men in this field to show that we can be caring and have an empathy, but also, to be honest, I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I had met people who in high school who were our social workers, and they said, "Why don't you be a social worker?" I think if they had said, "Why don't you be an architectural engineer?" I might have did that because I was just impressionable. I was 17 and decided, well, okay, fine, I'll do that. But I decided to go into social work, and you know, I ran cross country in college. I was an athlete, so that's how I went to college. And then also, I was rather smart. I had to, not to brag on it anyway, but it helped me get through without having a whole lot of debt to go through college. And then I went to grad school at University of Chicago, and that's when it really hit me that I did want to really be a social worker, but also a social worker who worked with Black men. And my very
Mm-hmm.
first internship as a young social worker was with young Black male boys in the South Side of Chicago. And I just recognized that because someone gave me the opportunity to be where I was, and they were predominantly people who were white, who identified as white, I wanted to be that Black male who gave them opportunities or access or instructions on how to guide their life. And that's why I decided I would only, I remember at 22, I said, I'm going to only ever work with Black men. I'm not going to be working with
Mm-hmm.
women or children unless they're males. You know, anyone who identifies as a male, I really decided that that had to be my goal because I just really felt, um, even and this is something that really, this is kind of a derivative, but anyway, it's kind of a tangent. But uh, when I was a social work grad student at University of Chicago, they told us about not going in certain neighborhoods because it was dangerous. And those were the Black neighborhoods around University of Chicago. And I kept thinking, this is when I had hair that could get cut. I would say, that's my barber's over there. And the rib joint I go to, and church and pop and chicken, Harold's Chicken is over there. And that's where I hang out with my people. Like, what do you mean I can't go
Mm-hmm.
there? And why is it
Mm-hmm.
so? I don't ever feel scared going over there. That's the neighborhood I grew up in. That's where I feel most comfortable is over
Mm-hmm.
there than over here. I feel more unnerved. I feel real
Mm-hmm.
comfortable over there. And so that also reminded me of that there's something more foundational here about how Blackness is viewed. And that's why I decided also this, I have to figure out a way to be engaged in Blackness in a way that uplifts people, um, particularly men, because I just really feel they are just not seen as a viable and pertinent member of the family, but the way social welfare and social policy has been set up. So anyway, that's what
Mm-hmm.
I did, and that's how I began my journey working in the area of looking at Black maleness or looking at men or masculinity or manhood. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I, I, I mean, I guess in terms of my dad journey, I've always wanted to be a father, but I decided to not make that a real thing happen until much later in my life. But
Mm-hmm.
my very first, as a matter of fact, it's really weird. This year, 40 years ago, I wrote my very first article on Black men, and it won an award in the state of Illinois because I was arguing about how services for young Black men was very much needed, and we were running a program called Parents Too Soon, and it was for, and so I started a center that is now celebrating its 50th year of the center was there 10 years before I went there, but it was celebrating
Mm-hmm.
the 50th year at Rush Presbyterian Hospital, and I started a program called the Male Adolescent Center, and it was for access for Black young, well, not for just Black men, but for young men in the West Side and South Side of Chicago to get birth control, to get, if they became a father too soon, to get counseling with me, to get services, to get access to services, to get help with a variety of things they might need to help them be able to be engaged with their children. And this was in the 80s, and the beginning of what I believe is some of the real pioneering work by others as well as myself on which we would call fatherhood,
Mm-hmm.
responsible fatherhood work in the future. And so that's just interesting. So it's interesting to even have this interview today because I was thinking I saw that article just the other day, and I was thinking I can't believe I did that. Um, a very young man wrote that article, and
Mm-hmm.
it was my director of the center at the time. But so my journey's been very interesting in that I've really have tried to do a lot of things around um, practice, but I've also done a lot of things around policy as I moved along in my career. And the majority of my work was definitely with practice. I did a lot of things with, primarily in the state of Illinois, around this work. From the hospital-based work I did, I was very engaged with school-based clinics when they were very controversial in the state of Illinois. I was connected to a center who had the very first school-based clinic, and it made national news when they said the pill goes to school. I was part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of that program, and very much understanding while it was important to recognize that kids are having babies, and the whole issue of adolescent teen pregnancy was very big at the time, and we were trying to reduce that. There was major initiatives to reduce that. I think we've been successful in reducing teenage pregnancy. It's still an issue, of course, but it's nowhere near the level it was back in the '80s from what I've seen over time in demographic work. But it's still an issue. And
Mm-hmm.
so again, along the way, I just really have tried my best to recognize what policies are in place or what practices are in place that engage or support Black men in their work, or of
Mm-hmm.
course, this delivery of services to Black men or Black boys, so that they can be the best person they can be that a parent or an individual who has children in society. So that's
Mm-hmm. When you think,
that's kind of a lot
yeah,
there.
when yeah, it's and a good. It's great stuff. Again, perspective is always what I'm trying to make sure that my listeners hear. As you were talking, I want to go stay in the beginnings for a couple of minutes because I think that also um, lends and paints a picture, which is what I want you to do for us. Because when you're talking Chicago, Chicago was similar to New York for me. I think
Mhm,
we're in the same generation, so we
mhm.
grew up around the same time as really young boys in the 60s and not really understanding what was taking place in the 60s around civil rights. But then as we moved into adolescence in the 70s, we began to start to understand and see things a little differently. But the interesting thing that I love about Chicago, and I want your perspective because I want you to paint a picture of the social welfare system back then. Two things. One is our adoration with good times. And with John Amos and the Evans family, and watching them on TV and seeing ourselves, no matter where we were in the country, in what communities, that family was our family. That construct, the friends, the at the end, the situations that they were in, all of those kinds of things. The beauty in Esther Roll, not allowing that sitcom to move forward without having a husband in our home was monumental. I don't think people understand exactly what that meant for us. But I was introduced to Chicago through a author by the name of Donald Goines. And Donald Goines was a author that wrote, uh, my goodness, what's the best stories about living in the underworld in Black life. And one of the books he wrote was a book on projects in the south side of Chicago called Cabrini Green. And I remember reading that book and saying to myself, wow, wait a minute, this is where the Evans families was. Like it came together for me. Like you're watching this thing on TV, but then you're reading this other book that's describing this community. So you begin to start to understand the weight of what was going on outside of that apartment. When you look back at the social space, social welfare field and space back then as a young man growing up in the system yourself, paint for us what that looked like because I don't think people understand exactly how much the system played a role in some of the dysfunctions that are impacting us today.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Cabrini Green was where I had my internship as a doctor, as an undergrad, as a master's student. I worked in Cabrini Green, so I was very
Hmm.
familiar with that system, and I remember having that epiphany when I said, "Oh, I'm working in good times area," and so it was like, this is good times." But um, it's interesting because the social engineering of how we're supposed to behave based on social welfare practices is what I've been arguing and fighting against for the last 30 years as an academic.
Mhm.
And what I've been uplifting about how when we talk about family, we don't often think about Black families as having men in their families. We don't think of Black men as being part of a family. We don't think about how this particular social engineering of what we have, and people often disagree with me, but that's fine because I'm gonna still do what I do. What I've seen in the social welfare system is that it doesn't want anyone on the system. And we're in a system that perpetuates a certain type of economic outcome. Somebody has to be poor in a capitalistic system. That's just the way it doesn't operate any other way. Somebody in all of these economic systems has to maintain poverty in order to maintain richness or wealth. It doesn't. You can't. Everyone cannot be wealthy. Somebody has to. You have to start at a certain level, and either you're able to reach that gold ring that you're trying to reach, or you may not reach that gold ring based on a number of circumstances, whether they be discriminatory or oppression or racism or sexism or whatever they may be. But in terms of the social welfare system, which I've argued consistently, when I talk to my students, I say, when you hear the social welfare system, and this is what was put in my head, which was wrong, is that when I heard social welfare system, I thought Black, because
Mhm.
that's what we are often shown in the media, and we're often taught that Blackness is bad. And Black people are full of joy. Black people are full of love. Black people are full of a lot of experiences that make them um, survive in a space that doesn't recognize their humanity and doesn't recognize their well-being and who they are. And so for me, what this system has done is perpetuated something about Black men and Black families, that everyone believes is the reason why we need to have welfare. One reasons why we don't need to have welfare is because we don't want to have them perpetuating certain types of activities, that whether it be having more babies or whether it be having what we say, people not being incentivized to work, to be a problem. And the thing is that when I went to grad school, I remember my professor saying to me, "Who do you think who's on welfare and who is using the system more than anyone else?" And my response was Black, because that's what I thought, because I was brainwashed, to be honest. And my teacher said, it can't be Black people. It has to be whites. And because there's more white people in this country than there are Black, and it's disproportionately, you might see more Black people, but the numbers are way higher amongst those who are white. And so we don't hear about white fathers being, what do we say, involved, not involved with their children. But we
Mhm.
hear a lot about Black fathers not being involved with their children, when there's always been, in my perception, people like a Jane Amos or Daddy, a Father from Good Times, who it may have been seen as illegal to what he was doing, but Daddy was around. Fathers were around, and they were doing the best they could. It may not have been what we deemed as the most acceptable thing, because I remember a lot of things falling off the truck when I was a kid, whether it be the whether it be the
Mhm.
meat that I received or the clothing that I received, or it might have been um, the bike that I received, and it
Mhm.
just happened to appear when I know we barely had money to pay the gas bill, or we were living, in our house, and all we had was the electricity. But we had a new bike, and I don't know where that came from. But it was this that the system perpetuates, but not just the system. And I mean, this is a debate that I get in with people a lot. It's not just the system. I think, unfortunately, some of us perpetuate that system, academics and those working in the field. Because I never saw that. And that's been my fight since I started working as a social worker and an academic, is that there's so many structural issues that perpetuate why people are where they are. And we're not interested in changing those, because we just are not, because it maintains this level of superiority, as well as reality that we want to live in, that there are certain people who are less than others. And so for me, for Black men and responsible fathers, um, I've been also someone who's been challenging that term, to be honest, because I
Mhm.
feel that Black men of all fathers are the most responsible, and research has proven that. um,
Mhm.
they may
Absolutely.
not, they may not always be in the light of showing that, but they are doing what they can based on some very significant milestones that are put in front of people who have less access to education and other services that will enable them to be the best they can be. But I do think in a space like a Cabrini Green, the one thing that hit me the most about the Black young men I worked in Cabrini Green was their environment was only Cabrini Green, and they knew not to live out, not to go outside that environment. And so when I
Mhm.
would take them on Michigan Avenue as a field trip, which was only 4 blocks from Cabrini Green, they were shocked at what they saw. They didn't know there was a thing like a Saks Fifth Avenue or a
Mhm.
water tower or a Garrett's popcorn. They didn't know
Mhm.
that there was a Wrigley building. They didn't never had never seen the Chicago River because they really had gotten into a mindset which people often get into who are um, in very structured um, spaces where they're told you're not allowed to do that. They don't understand that that your worth is more than just this space you're in. And so that was
Mhm.
my job as a young social worker, was to get these young men to know your worth is more than this space. Your worth is more than you can even imagine, and you can dream bigger than you thought you could dream if you just allow yourself to believe in yourself. And so that was my job as a social worker with those youth for that whole year that I worked with.
Yeah, one of the other interesting things that happened back then was the release of the Moynihan Report.
Mm,
That was, oftentimes people describe it as a research piece, and it's like it wasn't a research piece. It was a report that Senator Moynihan created as the secretary of, I always forget what he was secretary of, about the circumstance of people who were on welfare back
mm,
then. And one of the things that he found creating this report was the circumstances of specifically Black men in the welfare system.
mhm,
Um, and so, even when for Fathers Incorporated, when I created the research arm of Fathers Incorporated and called it the Moynihan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Policy, people would call me and send me emails like, why would you want to name your um, research institute after a white man? I'm like, first of all, it's not. Read our stuff and you'll find out exactly why I did it. It wasn't named after Senator Moynihan. It was named to reflect the actual report because that report has become the foundational starting point of how we began to frame Black families, specifically Black men, from a research perspective. And
mhm,
it makes sense to go back to that to either advance, illuminate, reconstruct, or evolve beyond the picture that that thing painted for us.
mhm.
When you think about the research and where we are today in your research, um, how much of what's happening, lack thereof, misguiding, wrong information, is research still not getting right as it relates to Black men and families?
I think, yeah, I mean, I wish there was more scholars who did the work that I do. I think there's too few. I'm working with a few now that are young scholars who I'm hoping will carry on whatever legacy I've tried to perpetuate around looking at the social structures, the systemic structures that have really impeded the ability of Black men or Black families to really succeed, but also to recognize how so many of these structures could be improved, but I'll need to have someone out there who is unafraid to take risk, and that's something I've tried to do all my life. Is I may not have very many friends or many people who call on me, but I'm going to say what I believe is the truth around how the system perpetuates certain myths and harm to families. And I try not to be always someone who sees the current whatever it may be the sexy thing to say.
Mm,
I try to avoid that because sometimes the sexy thing to say around what it means to be involved in this field may be causing more harm. And so my common thread has been how is race, class, and gender intersected in a variety of ways, and that's looking at, and also because I was very intrigued by your one of your podcasts you just did recently on redefining masculinity. I really felt that that's
mm,
something that we really need to have more conversations on. I really
mm,
think that it's a class that I'm going to be teaching in spring of 2026 is really looking at some of the groundbreaking work of many Black scholars and white scholars and kind of contrasting what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be masculine? Because these kids today have really been pushing it, and I think it's really something that's going to be very interesting when we look at where we're going as a society with Project 2025 and the new administration is coming in. There is a big emphasis on fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it may not be the way I philosophically agree with, but it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward. When I started doing this work, it was predominantly black men doing this work. There wasn't a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
white women, white men. No offense to them, but it's a different feel when when you are black and you've experienced the blackness and you've experienced fatherhood and you've experienced some of the issues that these men have faced, and you know pr- the the steps it takes to be successful in all of those, as a husband, as a brother, as an uncle, as a friend, as a father. It's a lot, and it's something you negotiate every day you walk out the door. As I tell my students, when I look in the mirror every day, I'm reminded, I better be reminded, I'm black and I'm male. So how are you going to present yourself today? Because one way you could present yourself one way, and that could be the last time you come home, or you may not come home, or you may come home. It's just that real for me. I feel every day, and so I think that we need to have more research that not just looks at the behavior of what these men are doing, but how is the structure perpetuating that behavior. I just finished 5 years of work looking at men coming out of the carceral system, and they're
Mm-hmm.
all black men, some Latino men, and yes, those men have maybe committed something that they should have been given some punishment for, but the system itself perpetuates a series of traumas and just not support for them to ever be successful. And people make a lot of money off of that system. I've learned more than I ever thought about. Um, and so it's just those type of examinations of where systems like the carceral system, the child support system, the child welfare system, I could go down the line, but those are the ones I've been looking at the most. And also, I just did a program where I gave out money in Philly over the last year, a guaranteed income program. And I had a couple of fathers in that project who were raising their children. And that's the story I just definitely want to tell people about, how there are men who are raising their children because the mothers are unable to. And people don't hear those stories ever about men who
Absolutely.
had and they're doing it based on, and these were all men who were, not all of them, but many of them were successful. One was a baseball player and just
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately had a car accident. And because of how we have defined manhood to be the breadwinner, to be head of household, there's some challenges with that for some people because they're not always able to maintain that. But because of if men have a issue where they get hurt, or they're not able to maintain that certain standard of living or standard of leadership, then they're seen as less than, and there's not supports for them because our system doesn't support generally men as parents or head of household as in what we see as the caregiving role,
Mm-hmm.
versus the financial role. And that to me has been very problematic. Like how we only see men trying barely as a paycheck or as a financial provider. Um, and of
Mm-hmm.
course, there's some reasons for that. One, men do make more money than women across all professions. I don't care who you are. There's
Mm-hmm.
data that shows that. So for that reason, it'd be great if there is a man in the household, if he's working, that he can help that economic well-being of that family. However, that's not the case for everybody. And
Right.
so anyway, it's very complicated, even in in this space. And I'm sorry if I'm not being as clear as I would like to be.
Oh, no, you are, like, you're dead on point, and I think what's happening in this conversation is that we're exposing, I guess, to lack of a better word, the complexity of what we're trying to deal with and what we're trying to explain and get people to understand and wrap their heads around to find some pathways um, for the betterment of our people. I think there's a couple of different things. You, like I'm very focused on making sure that my literal terms that I use in this space make sense
Hmm.
so that the descriptor of what it is we're trying to do is not lost in the societal narrative that makes us feel good today, right? And
Mhm.
so when we start talking about things like, um, so there is a couple of words that, and I don't use hate often, but I absolutely hate these words. And I hate when I hear them, I hate how they're used. More importantly, I hate the word fatherless. From my perspective, there is no such thing as a fatherless child. 100% of all biological children on the planet Earth has a biological child.
I'm thinking,
The
how they get
question
here?
is right. The question isn't if he exists. The question is where he exists.
Yeah.
And we never want to ask the question, where is he? And as a result of that, we make the assumption that he doesn't exist. The problem with that is we then perpetuate that idea to our children, and our children don't have explanation for the pain in that hole that is left by an absent parent. And
Mhm.
so using terms like absent parent speaks differently than fatherless because we don't use the word motherless. It's
Mhm.
just as either one of those is just as crazy to use. I also don't like when we're dealing with our systems, particularly when it comes to the court systems, and we use the terminology I won. Like what happened with you in court today? Oh, I won. Wait a minute. You won what? Like
Mhm.
you won your child, because in any scenario to which someone wins, someone loses.
Mhm.
And men don't like coming out of a court feeling like they lost, because the only person who really truly wins and loses in those scenarios is the child in and of themselves. When you look at the child support system, because people also don't want to have realistic conversations about the impact of the child support system, which was connected to the social welfare work that you were talking about earlier. Where are we missing it on that? And what are the advances that we need to be thinking about as it relates to how we frame child support in a way that fathers understand the importance of their financial contributions, but it doesn't become a definition of who they are?
Well, that's been child support was the centerpiece of the work I did, starting with a gift from the Ford Foundation under the leadership of Ronald Mincy. I was able to start the Center for Family Policy and Practice, which now would have been 30 years old if but I decided that after many years that it was just time for me to stop it, because I was very frustrated with how people viewed the child support system, and because child support is a machine all of itself. I think that the biggest issue for me with child support is, and I don't know whether I think that I was involved in a Supreme Court case in 2011, the Turner v. Rogers case. I was part of the research team that helped the attorneys take that case to the Supreme Court. And
Mhm.
with that case, I was very interested in telling what I did with the lawyers was really inform them on how the system was putting people in jail for non-payment and the reasons why they were doing it, but also how with the work I had been doing as a scholar and works I was doing with other scholars such as Tanya Brito, who's a law professor at UW-Madison, who worked with us on that team, worked with me on that team with those lawyers. We were trying to get them to understand that the biggest issue with child support is that they're supposed to follows a law that says people should only be charged what they have an ability to pay. And there has to be an investigation by the system to show their true ability to pay. Now, there are definitely men out there who are not taking care of their kids. And I'm all for, if you have children and you got money, you go get them, because that is not just one person's child. I don't care if you don't like that mama no more. I don't care, whatever. But if you have money, you need to take care of your kid. That's just your responsibility at minimum. Because kids, as you know, I know my kids are expensive. Even at the age of 35, they still expensive.
Right.
So I don't know if it ever goes away. That's something I heard the other day. Somebody like, you never stop worrying about your children, but you also never stop wanting to make sure they have the best they can if you're able to provide that. Because
Absolutely.
like,
Listen, I saw a meme. I saw a post the other day of a guy, and he was sitting watching the clock turn from 11:59 to 12 o'clock because
mhm,
his child support ended. And
okay,
like when it hit 12 o'clock, him and his family jumped up that his child support was over. I was like, man, you are misguided. You
yes,
actually believe that because that thing clicked to 12 o'clock, your child support is over. Your child support literally has just begun.
exactly. And yeah, so yes, because it seemed like, boy, these kids. But because I know that as a kid when I was their age, once I left home at 17, that was it. There was no, it was I just had to make it. But it's a new day anyway. But I think the one thing that I've been very proud of at that moment in 2011 was that when the court said Supreme Court ruled that courts must know what is a person's true ability to pay before they set a child support order. Now, are courts doing that? No, because no one's watching the courts. That's what I
Mhm.
that's what I do as a researcher, and that's the one thing I wanted to mention from earlier. Is that the one type of the research that is needed more on this work is storytelling. Someone needs
Mm.
there needs to be more people in court with these men, with these families, that their rights are being that they're receiving their just rights. Unfortunately, most courts I've been in over the country that I've observed, um, they're predominantly people whom are poor and black and brown. I don't see
Mhm.
hardly any white people ever in court because they don't
Mm.
have to go to court. They can make all the they can have a lot of those discussions with a lawyer that they can afford. But those poor whites who are in court as well still have a different experience from what I've observed in the United States. So I think one of the things that I wish that more people would do would be involved in looking at how people are learning about child support. I know that that's something that I've been arguing with, and that's something I did at the center has done over 25 years, and that material is still available to people to look at on a website that I've been able to maintain over the years. Um, but I think that people don't understand that the child support system that I talk about is the system tied to the social welfare system, where mothers have no option. And oftentimes, what I have found was that men and women did not understand how um, he thought it was her fault that he was on child support, and she felt she had some power to put him on child support when neither one of them have any power. Neither
Right.
she's being if she doesn't do it, the babies don't eat and the babies don't have any money. And if the and then the state says, well, if you're going to get this benefit, then we're going to go after whoever the non-custodial parent is. That's whether you are a heterosexual couple or a gay couple and have children and your own welfare. Someone's going to be deemed as a non-custodial parent, and the
Mhm.
non-custodial parent is going to pay back the state. Now, Illinois is the only state in the country at the present time where you get your full 100% child support back with no penalty, with no harm against whatever benefits you receive. Illinois just did that only most recently. They did it in 2024.
Mhm.
Um, and Colorado have been doing some of that, but there is a slight difference in how Colorado is doing their child support. We It's versus how Illinois is doing it. But I think that's the one thing people don't understand is that, and it causes harm that can lead to either domestic violence or not. Unfortunately, because people get angry when you don't have money and people's lives are complicated and they get frustrated. And it's not that simple, but I think that people don't look at the complexity of what this world means when you're poor. And this child support one is something that causes of all the issues I've seen over my lifetime as a social worker and academic, this one to me is the biggest issue around what it means, how it compromises parenting for both mothers and fathers who are poor and black.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
once the state gets involved, then there's really no negotiating between those parents as to how much money can I give you for the baby this week? Can I get my little shorty some shoes? Can I get my baby? Can I get the baby for the weekend? And we negotiate that way. Now the state's involved, and you're accumulating this debt, and you lose your license. You get jailed. You have a levy against you. Your credit's destroyed, and now we destroyed a whole family. And
Yeah.
that's the part that we're not focused on is how is the state destroying a family that had sex, that had a baby, and thought they and my parents when they did that did the best they could, and I'm now a professor, and they didn't have this issue. But
Yeah.
so it's the same family, but we now have destroyed that family because child support has gotten involved and other
Yeah.
systems have gotten involved, and other systems have
Yeah.
been destroying them. So anyway, it's a complicated story, but me having them have the real order they should have is what we should start out with, because many of these people should have zero orders. But I've heard so many times in court, judges say, "Well, you can stand out in front of the McDonald's and do a tap dance if you need to. Well, that's probably true. He could do that. But there's no thought of person's human dignity. And let's give people a job. Let's give them the education they deserve. Let's give them access to what they need to be the best they can be, as opposed to demonizing them for having sex. I don't.
Right.
I'm not agreeable with that.
Yeah. Where does or where do practitioners play a role in what you're describing to alleviate some of the issues that these families are having? I continue to believe that I've been fortunate. I've been blessed
Hmm.
as one of the fatherhood agencies that's been able to get my hands around a critical component of this work, which is the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse. Been able to hold on that to now for 16 years and do some incredible work, with that. But that work has also given me the ability to see a lot and be in a lot of different places and build some sustainability around my organization, Fathers Incorporated, which then allows me to do what we're doing right now. And
Hmm.
so I can do that. So what I've come to understand is that sustainability and resources are critically important in doing this work. I get to do this work at a very high level because I'm
Yes.
resourced in a way to be able to do that. But when I look around the span of responsible fatherhood, solely mission responsible fatherhood organizations around the country that look like you and I could probably count them on one hand. And so the question is, as we continue to fight to reimagine and reorchestrate what research looks like and tell the authentic story,
Mm.
where does the work begin and where is the infrastructure that allows us to go into the communities that you and I are talking about? South side of Chicago, Brownsville, New York, the barrio in Miami, the
Yeah.
hood in LA, St. Louis, Houston, Columbia, South Carolina, Pittsburgh. Where does the infrastructure or the building of that infrastructure and who has responsibility for doing that? Because it can't be solely the feds, because the feds right now are the primary funder of responsible fatherhood work in this country.
Yeah.
And so, but with very little support from philanthropic, corporate, and more sadly, individual donations,
Hmm.
because people care more about puppies, seals, and trees than they do black men and families. And
Yeah.
that's just the reality. I'm 60, 20, 30, 20 years in this particular game. I have the ability to understand this and but I still can't get people to care more about black men families and their children than some of the other things they support. So from a practitioner perspective, where is it that that work begins?
Well, Ken, I want to first say, I meant to say this earlier. I applaud that you've been in this as long as you have been, and that's exactly the reason why I'm not in it. like I This is exactly the reason why I decided to do it on the academic side and also trying to change policy. It is hard work. None of my funders over my 25 years of my center were white except for one. I could never get a white program officer to understand the work I was doing around policy and black men, and it was very hard to convince them. I had to. I always say to Ron, and he gets embarrassed by it. He was a godsend to even recognize that there was a need for the work that he wanted me to do when he came to me in 1994 to begin the center that I began, because he understood blackness. He understood maleness. We may have a slightly different philosophical thought of what we thought it would be, but we both understood that there was the need for the recognition of black men, and he was able to convince other funders because of the status he had at the Ford Foundation. But over those years, I could never convince a white person who was a program officer, except for one. He was at Mott. He was at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the value of this work in terms of black men and fathers, black
Mhm.
men, fathers, and policy, and why it was so important to have someone challenge how this was going down, because it wasn't helping. For practitioners, what I find really hard is, one, they don't get paid enough, and this is hard work. And you're
Mm.
asking them to do you're asking them to do God's work, extraordinary work, because raising a family, I don't care how much money you got, it's expensive, and it takes a lot of mental and financial wherewithal to do this. I think of people like the woman in Charleston, the Sisters of the South. They're in South Carolina. I can't think of her name. I think it's Patricia Pat somebody.
Little John, Pat
Little
Little John.
and Pat Littlejohn was someone who was also early on someone who did the work, who I applauded her work and in terms of what she was doing, and she's still around. But there is something about whiteness. I'm gonna have to be honest about it,
Hmm.
where people will hear them differently. I often get charged. I used to, I don't know, as not as much, but I used to get charged of being empathetic or being too sympathetic to what I was doing and not having a clear vision because I'm black and they're black. So my work was more minimized for that reason. And I think because so many practitioners who do this work, maybe they may not be in charge, but the ones on the ground are black and brown women, and
Hmm.
they're not seen in the same situation of value. They're not seen in the same position of respect, and that's problematic
Hmm.
for me because they're doing hard work, and oftentimes we buy into the same okey doke that the people are selling us, that these men are not worthy, these men are not good, and the recruitment of men into programs is some hard work for good reasons because they don't want to be
Yeah.
involved in some of the things you're selling. They don't, and
Right.
they and because of how we define masculinity is, I don't need to hear about parenting. I need to get a job. But I need to, but the program requires me to do parenting. And if I don't do this and you don't come to these classes, then I can't get funded. So it's like this conundrum. What do you do? Because it is really difficult to do this work. And I don't think practitioners, one, get paid enough for the work they do. They just don't. They don't get enough training. And they themselves often don't understand how the system works because they're so focused on people's behavior. And
Hmm.
if their behavior is not um, operating in a way that is seen, in my opinion, respectable or legitimate, then you toss them aside and you move on, and that's unfortunate. I'm not saying all practitioners do that, but I've seen it,
Hmm.
and that's and I've started to be more critical of practitioners. But also, it's not all practitioners' fault because they don't get enough resources to do the work they need to do because we don't really value this work. Many people don't really value this work. And unfortunately, the major people, and like you said earlier, the only people really funding this fatherhood work is child support. And that's been my argument too. That if the only people funding this work is child support, and child support main job is for you to get a job to pay your child support, you're giving them, it's like people are not stupid. I'm seeing through this that you're only having me go through this to get money you're going to take out of my check to reimburse you, and my kid doesn't get it when my kid is running
Hmm.
a responsible thing. And so people start seeing that. Not everybody,
Hmm.
but it's just that it's a more complicated thing than people want to admit. But I think for practitioners, they need more services, they need more pay, they need more training. But all of that requires time and money that we all like often they don't have because you have to meet those goals that are set in those proposals. And if you don't do that, that's problematic. But I did want to again recognize you for all the work you've done and you're staying in the game. And I really appreciate this opportunity to have a candid conversation about where voices are around this level of work. But for me, it's been primarily trying to change policy and have people recognize how the policy works. Because many people still don't even know, people don't even still know that when you get an TANF check, that you must cooperate with child support. That's something that really baffles me, that people really still don't even know that parents
Hmm.
are engineered in a way when you're poor that you hear child support and you think, oh, it's like Madonna and her man having or if Jay-Z and Beyonce got a divorce. No, this is not that type of child support. This is reimbursement to the state, and that's how it works. That is how it's always worked. So,
Yeah, but the crazy thing about it is though, and this is again, the complexity of this conversation we're having is so freaking broad and wide, it's ridiculous.
mm,
Because at some point you have to start looking at the infrastructure of how we got to where we are and
mhm,
some of the other outside impacts that have had a direct impact on how we function.
mhm,
One of those is in the space of communication, right? And so when we think about like where Black people got their news from,
Mhm.
in the 60s and 70s in the church basement, from the local radio DJ who lived in the community, from the local newspaper, that spoke about things that were going on in your community. And that, what you just talked about, which is informing people of what they should understand about the world they were engaged in. Like those, when the attack on Black media happened and the disbursement of Black media, newspapers, radio stations, magazines, all of those things dispersed and then began to become owned by others that didn't look like us and didn't have interest in us. Stop telling that story. It cut off our communication funnels, and now our children don't really know. Our Gen Z children don't
Mhm.
remember what it was like, right, to come in the house and not have a cell phone that you could be immersed in information that ain't got nothing to do with you,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But come in and sit around the dinner table every night
Mhm.
and listen to your parents talk about the situation of the day.
Exactly.
Right? And so when we start looking at what has happened to the infrastructure of Black families in general, there has to be a connect between that and what we're talking about and why we can't get past and why it's so difficult and complex to get past that because nobody wants to look back.
Yeah.
Everybody says, as soon as you start a sentence, well, back in my day, people shut off, right?
Exactly.
We're the only folks that want to disconnect our past from our present. Like we want to disassociate with it. And then that's a trauma response,
Yeah,
right? And then we
exactly.
have to talk about that. Like,
Yeah.
why is that a trauma response? And what is that trauma response doing to our current circumstances that's
Yeah.
halting our development to do better
Yeah,
and be
exactly.
better?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, and that's where I get, in the research space, where, I've had some conversations with some folks that, we really need to get back to holding smaller think tank conferences
Oh, I
between
agree.
thought leaders and thinkers that come into the room and strategize on where we should be going and how we should be doing that without amplifying what we're talking about on social media so that in the realm of destroying that pathway can occur because no
Mm,
one else does that but us.
mm.
And what does that look like? What does that conversation look like? And then more importantly for us, right, who's at the table? Because that's an issue, right? The issue is, well, who is that? Who are those 25 people going to be? And why is it those people and not these people? When you start to look at, as we move forward and kind of get to the end of this, I want your perspective on this. um, People like Richard Reeves and Ludo Delgado and others, you talked about this earlier, that are beginning to have more specific conversations about masculinity and more importantly, what they have described as the attack on masculinity.
Mhm.
But when I'm looking at these conversations, Dr. Pate, one of the things that is not disturbing me yet is bothering me, and it only is saying to me, Kenny, you can't get mad at their perspective. You only have to raise your own perspective. Is that the conversation, this gender conversation around men and boys, looks like a general conversation that excludes the very specific narrative of Black men and boys. And so we just have to, if they're going to raise it, then we have to raise it with them in a way that we ensure that our narrative isn't lost in the conversation because we're dealing with the same thing, but there's a different nuance for us that needs to be discussed. And
Mm.
when you start looking forward at what is possibly going to happen, through the next administration and the elimination of DEI and first, and all these other things that are going to take place. Where do you think we're going, or where does the conversation have to go as it relates to masculinity, and can it survive what is constructed or what people are constructing to believe, this attack on masculinity and um, um the weakening of who we are as men?
Yeah. I think it's for me, it's a good conversation and a scary conversation, to be honest. And that's why
Mhm.
I decided to teach this class. That's why I'm constructing this class called The Design of Manhood and Masculinity in a family context. I'm going to teach it. I'm looking to teach. And I'm going to take a whole year to look at all types of readings and listen out. And also I probably am going to interview a variety of men for the next year, just having them tell me what does it mean to be a man to them. Because
Mhm.
I have students who I don't know how many students I don't know if you have the same access as I do, but I have students who come to my class who appear as men, but they identify as she. They identify
Mhm.
as him. And I think that this fluidity for is challenging Christian values, is challenging regular family, not regular, it's challenging what we consider family values. It's just challenging who who is what is it, and the thing that I think what you said is so important is that when you look at black manhood versus white manhood versus Latino manhood, we all have very cultural, ethnic, certain practices that we bring to the table based on our cultural and ethnic upbringing, whether we were born in the South or the North. And that could be with someone who's black. Someone in the South is more likely to say yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, and have a certain way they may approach the woman, and ways they may even approach how they may marry somebody. Where me from Philly, I just do what I did in my own way. I may not be saying yes, ma'am. I may say yes, sir, or no, ma'am, or something like that, but not in the same way. Because just because you're black doesn't mean that you're going to be the same across the country. Just because you're white doesn't mean you're going to be the same. But there are certain privileges that are ascribed to you just based on your race. And that's something we don't talk about, is that race is a social construct, and race brings with it privileges, and skin color brings with it privileges, and gender brings with it privileges. Um, and that's the part that I think is really, I'm hoping that people don't miss. I'm very curious about Richard Reeves' space. I just learned about it recently. I just haven't really delved into it. I did listen to your podcast a little bit with your guest that you had, and I was intrigued by what he said. And I'm gonna listen to it further for my own education. I just think that it's a difficult conversation, and I think that it's one that's going to be there's going to be different camps as to how we define what masculinity and manhood is going to be, and we're not going to agree. We just have to
Mhm.
go knowing we're not going to agree, just based on what people bring to the table and what people are going to be comfortable or uncomfortable with. Because manhood is not what I thought it was when I was a kid. I mean, it's definitely different. It's definitely different than when it's definitely different. And I think that social welfare systems are trying to maintain something that's outdated. I'm just be honest. I think that the way we look at society, the way society is developing with this new generation of youth and young adults, and I see it with my students in particular, white and black students, that
Mhm.
um, it's not the same. In fact, the at UW Madison, four black male students just approached me because they're starting a masculinity group. And
Wow.
that's this is all on their own initiative, and they happened to hear that I study black men, and they said, "Oh, would you come and be one of our speakers one time, or would you be our advisor?" And I said, whose idea was this? And it was four young black men, and they said
Mhm.
everyone's invited, but it's really the focus on what does it mean to be black and male in America, period. And
Wow.
I think that to me is phenomenal that they are starting to think about. And again, the group of young men who approach me, um, are coming from different genres. I'm not sure how they identify sexually or gender wise, but I could feel there was something very different based on the conversation. And I'm very intrigued by hearing this conversation and where they're going to take it. And I think it's something I think it's a reality of what some of us old heads, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
have to contend with, and
Mhm. Mhm.
either support or say we're not going to support it, but be honest. That's the one thing I find that's most frustrating is people are just not honest. If you don't support something, just say you don't support it, but don't
Right.
act like you do. Just say I'm against it. That's the one thing I have to say based on where we are in this world. Some people have been very blatant about who they are, and that might be why they've been successful, to be honest, because I
Yeah.
think honesty has not been something that we have totally embraced, and it's frustrating that we haven't embraced being honest about if we don't like it, then you don't. then we don't say that. We just say we like it just to either get the buck or to say it makes us have friends or not to have enemies. And I prefer you just tell me, be honest with me. And I think if we have more honesty about where we are, we'd be further along, and how we could come to some resolution of where we all agree about
Yeah.
all areas of work. But that's where we are. I don't know about again. I'm going on these
Yeah,
tangents.
no, you listen, you said you singing my song, bro. You singing my song. And so thank you, man. Thank you for again, I am inspired by another brilliant mind. And so my wheels are turning how you and I can connect and begin to orchestrate some of what you and I are talking about.
Mm,
And really begin to put some structure around this towards doing something significant in this space. My mantra for 2025 is bold and unapologetic. And that is kind of where I'm moving in
mm,
2025, not in a destructive way,
yeah,
but to your point, making clear my standards, making clear my desires, making clear what I'm after, making it clear what I'm trying to impact, and doing that in a very bold and unapologetic way, but not in a disrespectful or dismissing way. It
yeah,
is, to your point earlier, this is my reality. This is who I am. This
yeah.
is this is what I bring to the table.
And I have to say, I've appreciated all people's perspectives. Again, I may not agree with people, but I think that you have to bring people. Some people will bring this group with them, and some people bring this group with them. But then when we all get together, the main goal is we want our children to all be better off. We all want to
Right.
be in a good space. We may not agree, that's fine. But if we could just all be in a good space where we are able to eat, drink, and live in a way that's humane and treated with respect. That's all I ask, and that we agree to disagree. That's fine too. I think that's the only
Right.
way we can get to a place where we all can come to a unified understanding of what it takes for people whom are of color, who already have these other barriers they have to deal with, are able to overcome them. But we have to figure out, how do we, okay, this is your camp. Okay, great. I know what you do. Go do your thing. And that's the one thing, and I have to mention one person before we go. Halbert Sullivan was my hero.
Mm,
Halbert and I
mm.
agree on a lot of things, but I loved Halbert. Halbert and I could have great conversations, and he knew his camp, and I knew mine. But I would support him when I could with what I knew, because I knew I was good in one area, and he was good in an area, and he would go some places I wouldn't go. But in the end, it was to make sure those fathers could be involved with their children, in a way that was fair and safe and respectful. And that's what I really loved about Halvin. I'm so sorry he's not here anymore, but he was somebody who really was my buddy, and I could go to, and he would argue with me, and argue with my wife as well about our work on domestic violence. But he knew where we were, and that's what I totally miss about having that kind of conversation, because there's not many people who will let you do that with them and still sincerely love you as a person.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a gift. That's what I miss about him as well. And trying to make sure that I, remain and sustain that spirit
Yeah,
in this space. Not trying to be the angry black man, because you know what happens when you become that, right? And when you're the angry black man, then nobody wants you at the party. Nobody wants
yeah,
you there. And so there's a
yeah,
fine line
yeah.
between being those two people. But Dr.
Oh,
Pate, thank
definitely.
you so much, brother.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Um,
so much again, and happy New Year as well.
Yeah, we're gonna have some more conversations. We're gonna figure this thing out one way or the other. And to my I Am Dad podcast listeners, thank you for joining us on another episode. You know how I like to leave you: always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you may find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend and mentor Art Mitchell used to always say to me, Kenny, it's nice to be important, but it's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, God bless and peace out.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad Podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.